From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
The level of corruption and wealth among Iranian leaders shows that Iran is run by something that resembles the mafia more than a government.
Secretary of State Pompeo delivers a speech against Iran Sunday. President Trump follows up by tweeting, "Never, ever threaten the United States again, or you will suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before." We'll get response from Trita Parsi of the National Iranian American Council. Then we look at direct action against nuclear weapons in the United States.
Wanted very much to get as close as we possibly could to the heart of evil, which is to say the weapon systems themselves.
On the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, 7 Catholic Plowshares activists secretly entered naval submarine base Kings Bay in Georgia, one of the largest nuclear submarine bases in the world. They were armed with just hammers, crime scene tape, baby bottles containing their own blood, and an indictment charging the U.S. government with crimes against peace. It was the latest of 100 similar anti-nuclear plowshares actions around the world. The majority of the activists are in jail. We'll speak with 2 who are out. Carmen Trotta of Catholic Worker, and Martha Hennessy, granddaughter of Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker movement. Then, has Israel legalized apartheid?
This is a defining moment in the annals of Zionism and the history of the State of Israel.
As Israeli lawmakers pass a law defining Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people, giving them the sole right to self-determination, we'll get response from Youssef Monayer of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights and Rebecca Vilkomerson of Jewish Voice for Peace. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump lashed out at Iran Sunday, warning he was prepared to unleash dire consequences on Iran if its president threatens the United States again. In a Sunday evening tweet addressed to Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and written in all caps, Trump wrote, "Never, ever threaten the United States again, or you'll suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. We're no longer a country that'll stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious," unquote. Trump's threat came just hours after President Rouhani warned the U.S. against attacking Iran, saying, quote, "War with Iran is the mother of all wars."
Mr. Trump, don't play with the lion's tail. This would only lead to regret. You will forever regret it.
Rouhani's comments came after he learned Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was set to address the Iranian-American audience in California at the Reagan Library. During those remarks delivered Sunday, Secretary of State Pompeo compared Iran's leaders to con artists and mobsters. This comes as the U.S. is working to restore sanctions against Iran and companies that do business with Iran after Trump withdrew the U.S. from the landmark 2015 Iran nuclear deal in May. We'll have more on the Trump administration's war of words with Iran later in the broadcast. In Afghanistan, at least 14 people were killed and more than 40 others wounded Sunday after a suicide bomber struck near Kabul's main airport. The attack ripped through a crowd of supporters of Afghan Vice President Rashid Dostum, an ethnic Uzbek politician who just returned to the Afghan capital after more than a year of self-imposed exile. Dostum was unharmed in the explosion. He left Afghanistan last year after the country's attorney general ordered the arrest of his bodyguards for allegedly torturing and sexually assaulting a rival politician. Dostum was also involved in a massacre in 2001 that killed up to 2,000 Taliban prisoners of war. Elsewhere in Afghanistan Sunday, gunmen stormed a mosque in eastern Nangarhar province, opening fire and killing 4 worshippers during evening prayers. In northwestern Pakistan, a suicide bomber struck a convoy carrying a candidate in Pakistan's general election, killing him and his driver and wounding 3 other people. The Pakistani Taliban claimed responsibility for the attack, which killed Ikramullah Gandapur, a member of the Pakistan Justice Movement, the party headed by former cricket star turned election frontrunner Imran Khan. The bombing came on the eve of Wednesday's general election amidst increasing violence aimed at derailing the vote. Earlier this month, a massive suicide bombing claimed by ISIS at an election campaign gathering in the southwestern province of Balochistan killed 151 people, injuring another 200. Back in the United States, the FBI has obtained a recording in which Donald Trump discussed how to suppress the story of Karen McDougal, a former Playboy model who alleges she had a year-long extramarital affair with Trump in 2006. In the tape made before the 2016 election, Trump reportedly discussed with his former attorney and fixer Michael Cohen whether to buy the exclusive rights to the story of Karen McDougal, who alleges she had an affair with Trump. At the time, McDougal had sold her story for $150,000 to the National Enquirer, a tabloid published by Trump's close friend David Pecker. The paper ultimately kept the rights to the story and refused to publish it in a process known as catch and kill. The tape will now be available to prosecutors in any future criminal investigation of Michael Cohen after Trump's legal team reportedly waived attorney-client privilege on the recording. On Sunday, the lawyer for another woman Trump allegedly had an affair with, adult film star Stephanie Clifford, known as Stormy Daniels, predicted more recordings of Trump's conversations with Michael Cohen will emerge. This is Stormy Daniels' lawyer, Michael Avenatti, speaking on ABC this week.
This is not the only tape. I can tell you that for a fact. There's multiple tapes.
You don't know that there are more tapes of President Trump, though?
No, I do know there's more tapes of President Trump. There's multiple tapes of President Trump, number one. All right, so that's first of all. That ultimately is going to prove to be a big problem for the president. You know, that old adage, you live by the sword, you die by the sword, is going to be true in this case because the president knew that his attorney, Michael Cohen, had a predisposition towards taping conversations with people.
President Trump's former foreign policy advisor, Carter Page, has denied working as a Russian spy after the FBI released more than 400 pages from an application for a foreign surveillance warrant, alleging he was targeted for recruitment by the Russian government. In the heavily redacted document, the FBI said it, quote, believes Page has been collaborating and conspiring with the Russian government. There's probable cause that such activities are about to involve violations of the criminal statutes of the United States, unquote. Carter Page is yet to be charged with the crime. On Sunday, he called the FISA warrant misleading and a complete joke. This comes as President Trump once again reversed his position on whether Russia interfered in the 2016 election. After returning to Washington following a weekend spent golfing at his New Jersey golf course, Trump tweeted reports of Russian meddling were, quote, all a big hoax. Trump's latest reversal came after he tried to walk back his remark made at his summit earlier this month with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Helsinki that he didn't see any reason why Russia would have meddled in the 2016 election. In Israel, a fragile ceasefire remains in effect after 4 Palestinians and 1 Israeli soldier were killed during violence Friday along the border with Gaza. During the flare-up, Israel launched dozens of strikes it said were targeted at Hamas rockets and mortars. The death of the Israeli soldier was the first since Palestinians launched weekly nonviolent protests at the border at the end of March. Israeli forces have shot and killed at least 140 Palestinians during these protests, while wounding thousands of others. We'll have the latest from Israel and Palestine later in the broadcast. In Israel, hundreds of members of the Syria civil defense group known as the White Helmets have been evacuated to Jordan along with their family members as Syrian government forces advanced on their position. The evacuation was facilitated by Israeli forces who ferried some 422 volunteers and family members to Jordan after granting them access to the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights. The UK, Germany and Canada have agreed to process the refugees' asylum claims. The evacuation came as thousands of other Syrians have massed along the border with the Golan Heights as Syrian forces continue airstrikes nearby. A number of Syrians who braved minefields along the border approached Israel's border fence where they were reportedly turned around by Israeli troops. Ecuador's president has cleared the way for his government to withdraw asylum protection for WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange and to hand him over to British authorities. That's according to The Intercept, which reports Assange could soon face a prison term of up to 2 years if he's convicted of contempt of court for missing a bail hearing after he holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in London more than 5 years ago as he sought to avoid a Swedish sexual assault investigation. He was cleared of any of those charges by Sweden. This comes as the Trump administration is reportedly planning to seek Assange's extradition to the U.S., where he could face espionage charges. Back in the United States, President Trump has once again called for NFL players who take a knee during the playing of the national anthem to be punished. On Friday, Trump tweeted players must stand at attention, hand on heart, calling out NFL Commissioner Roger Goodell over his $40 million annual salary, demanding first time kneeling, out for game, second time kneeling, out for season, no pay, unquote. Over the past 2 seasons, dozens of players have knelt during the anthem to protest police shootings of unarmed black men. And Cuba's National Assembly has approved a new draft constitution that would pave the way for marriage equality. The document would define marriage as a, quote, consensual union of two people regardless of gender. This is Mariela Castro, daughter of former President Raul Castro and director of the Cuban National Center for Sex Education.
As in the Constitution, marriage was established for heterosexuals based on heteronormativity, and so I think we have the right to place another vision of marriage that's much more inclusive, that guarantees rights that up till now we haven't guaranteed. And something I say to a lot of people, giving rights to someone doesn't mean taking them away from those who already have them.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump lashed out at Iran Sunday, warning he was prepared to unleash dire consequences on Iran if its president threatens the United States again. In a Sunday evening tweet addressed to Iranian President Hassan Rouhani and written in all caps, Trump wrote, "Never, ever threaten the United States again, or you'll suffer consequences the likes of which few throughout history have ever suffered before. We're no longer a country that'll stand for your demented words of violence and death. Be cautious," he tweeted. Trump's threat came just hours after Rouhani's speech earlier Sunday, in which the Iranian president warned the U.S. about pursuing a hostile policy against his government.
Mr. Trump, don't play with the lion's tail. This would only lead to regret. You will forever regret it. We have been the guarantor of the regional waterways security throughout history. Remember, we established the security of oil shipping routes throughout history. Don't forget this. You are not in a position to incite the Iranian nation against Iran's security and interests. The Iranian nation knows its interests and sacrifices to protect it. You are mistaken.
This comes as the United States has stepped up pressure on Iran, saying it'll reimpose sanctions after Trump decided to withdraw from a 2015 nuclear deal that was crafted by the Obama administration. In a speech Sunday to a largely Iranian-American audience, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo compared Iran's leaders to a mafia and promised unspecified backing for Iranians who are unhappy with their government. Pompeo spoke at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library outside Los Angeles.
The level of corruption and wealth among Iranian leaders shows that Iran is run by something that resembles the mafia more than a government. The regime's revolutionary goals and willingness to commit violent acts haven't produced anyone to lead Iran that can be remotely called a moderate or a statesman. Some believe that President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif fit that bill. The truth is they're merely polished frontmen for the Ayatollah's international con artistry. Their nuclear deal didn't make them moderates. It made them wolves in sheep's clothing. Governments around the world worry that confronting the Islamic Republic harms the cause of moderates. But these so-called moderates within the regime are still violent Islamic revolutionaries with an anti-America, anti-West agenda. You only have to take their own words for it.
Secretary of State Pompeo stopped short of calling for regime change, but members of the Trump administration, including National Security Advisor John Bolton and Trump attorney Rudy Giuliani, have ties to the Mujahideen Khalq, or MEK, a group of Iranian exiles who've called for regime change in Iran. The MEK was once on the State Department's list of foreign terrorist organizations before reinventing itself as a moderate political group. On Sunday, the National Iranian American Council placed a full-page ad in the Los Angeles Times with an open letter to Pompeo that criticized the Trump administration's ties to MEK, writing support for violent organizations such as Mujahideen al-Khalq, which has used terror to kill Iranians and Americans alike by key advisors to and members of the Trump administration, raises serious concerns as to whether your administration's objective is to support the Iranian people's struggle for democracy and independence or to use their legitimate grievances to destabilize Iran and turn it into a failed state. Well, for more, we go to Washington, D.C., where we're joined by Trita Parsi, founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. His most recent book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. His most recent piece for the New York Review of Books headlined, Why Trump's Hawks Back the MEK Terrorist Cult. Welcome back to Democracy Now!, Trita.
Thank you so much for
having
me. Talk
about the Rouhani's comments, Pompeo's speech, and now most recently, President Trump's threatening tweet against Iran.
Well, I think Pompeo's speech and the effort that he gave to essentially give the impression that he cares for the Iranian people was quickly negated by this rather unprecedented tweet by Donald Trump, essentially threatening war over Twitter. And I think it reveals that now, beyond any doubt, the Trump administration's policy is, and frankly has always been, escalation and confrontation. Whether that confrontation will take place through a direct military confrontation or whether it will be the Trump administration continuing and intensifying their efforts to destabilize Iran, or as Reuters reported over the weekend, to foment unrest in Iran, remains to be seen. But without a doubt, this is not an administration that is pursuing a policy of actually trying to find a new way to the negotiating table or striking a new deal. Everything they're doing right now is only compatible with a policy of confrontation.
I want to turn back to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo speaking Sunday.
Right now, the United States is undertaking a diplomatic and financial pressure campaign to cut off the funds that the regime uses to enrich itself and support death and destruction. We have an obligation to put maximum pressure on the regime's ability to generate and move money, and we will do so. At the center of this campaign is the reimposition of sanctions on Iran's banking and energy sectors. As we've explained over the last few weeks, our focus is to work with countries importing Iranian crude oil to get imports as close to zero as possible.
That's Pompeo. Trita Parsi.
So I think you will see there's a lot of what he said when it comes to criticism of the government in Iran that a lot of people would agree with, because at the end of the day, this is a government that has been very repressive politically. It is incompetent in many areas, and its corruption is only increasing over time. But I think there's a major leap of faith to believe that all of these problems and the frustration that they generate will cause people to think that Pompeo, Trump, and John Bolton are the answers to Iran's problems. And while they are undermining democracy in the United States, they would somehow miraculously be the answer to increase democracy in Iran. So I think this is rhetoric that ultimately is going to fail, but it is nevertheless indicative of where this administration wants to go with its Iran policy. And I'm very worried that the pattern that we've seen before, which is that when the United States escalates, the Iranians escalate as well. And they have made threats of saying that if they cannot sell oil and they cannot ship oil out of the Strait of Hormuz, then no one can, threatening to close it. This is going to have a devastating effect on the global economic markets, but also it will risk sparking a larger military confrontation, because if the Iranians do this in response to efforts by Trump to reduce their oil sales to zero, then the U.S. will move in militarily. So this is a very dangerous moment with very unresponsible people here at the helm in Washington.
So can you talk about the timing of all of this? You knew last week that Pompeo was preparing to give this address, and I want to ask you who the Iranian-American audience was at the Reagan Library where he spoke on Sunday. Rouhani made his comments before Pompeo spoke, but clearly knowing about this. And then Trump made his threat late last night.
Yeah, this is an escalation that has been going on and taking place for some time. And I think the timing of it is indicative of the Trump administration being ready to take their escalatory and confrontational policy to the next level. I frankly believe that they would have liked to do this much earlier, but earlier on, as you know, there were members of the Trump administration that were not in line with this thinking and who wanted to stay in the Iran nuclear deal. So it's taken them a year and a half before they can get to this point. But it seems to me that Trump always wanted to move in this direction. When it comes to the audience yesterday, I spoke to several people in the audience. It's a mixture. There's a lot of people who want to see the United States take a much more belligerent policy. They're a very small group within the Iranian-American community, but they have numbers in Los Angeles, and many of them were in the audience. There were people who were there simply out of curiosity. They did not believe necessarily that their presence would be seen as support for what Pompeo was saying. But I think it's also important to note that based on several people I spoke to, as well as footage that came out of there, the majority of the people in the audience were not Iranian Americans. Even though this was presented as an address to the Iranian American community, the majority of the people in the room were actually non-Iranian Americans. And in fact, it goes to a larger point here. If the Trump administration actually was interested in a genuine dialogue with the Iranian American community, that dialogue should have been initiated before Trump imposed the Muslim ban. It should have been initiated before he pulled out of the nuclear deal. To come now and say that he wants to have a dialogue and is interested in hearing what the Iranian-American community has to say simply doesn't come across as particularly genuine, because he's already made his major policy moves and he's so deep into his policy, it's very difficult to see that any feedback from the Iranian-American community could influence him to even marginally change that policy.
Now, Trita, can you put this in the context of the Helsinki summit, the meeting that Trump had with President Putin of Russia? We don't know what they talked about for 2 hours. But what is Russia's interest here?
So, as you mentioned, we don't know exactly what was being said, but it is a very important part of this puzzle, because the Russians so far, I wouldn't say that they're allies with Iran, but they have aligned interest in some areas. They've had it to a certain extent in Syria, and perhaps most importantly, the Russians don't want to see the United States be able to have more governments in the Middle East that are aligned with Washington. So in that sense, they do appreciate that Iran is quite opposed to American influence in the Middle East. But the Russians have more important interest at heart as well, which is particularly breaking out of their own sanctions that the U.S. have imposed on them, as well as issues such as NATO expansion, Ukraine, etc. So there's a gamble from the Trump administration's side in which essentially by offering the Russians anything they want on Ukraine and some other issues, that they would get the Russians to throw the Iranians under the bus. What they may not be as sensitive to is that if that scenario were to take place, it's not so much Russia throwing Iran under the bus as it is the United States throwing Europe under the bus. And this may also explain why Trump has been so negative in his rhetoric towards the Europeans.
What he had to say in his very hostile tweet last night towards Iran sounded very similar to, just about a year ago, speaking against North Korea. There are some who are saying this could mean he's preparing to try to make peace with Iran.
I find that somewhat unlikely, and I'll explain why. Certainly on the surface, it does look like that. And if this is some sort of a bizarre negotiation strategy, then at the end of the day, it is much better if the Trump administration and the Iranians negotiate than to move down a path of confrontation. But I think we have to keep a very important element in mind. In Asia, around North Korea, almost all of America's allies and even some of America's competitors wanted to see a diplomatic effort between the United States and North Korea, and they desperately wanted to avoid a war between the two countries precisely because such a war would be nuclear. In the Middle East, you have a very different scenario. America's close allies in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Israel, do not favor diplomacy with Iran, have opposed any dialogue between Tehran and Washington, and are on record for the last 10, 15 years pushing the United States to go to war with Iran. Former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates said that the Saudis want to fight the Iranians till the last American. So mindful of this and mindful of the susceptibility of the Trump administration to pressure from these governments, it simply is far less likely that the end game that Trump has with this tweet is to actually drive things towards a negotiating table.
And MEK, explain who they are and whether you think they're clearly Pompeo is threatening regime change here, and what does that have to do with MEK?
Well, the MEK is Iranian opposition group that was founded back in the 1960s. Is actually the first opposition group in Iran that started to use violence against the Shah's regime. It actually did enjoy a degree of popularity in Iran in the 1970s, but they were also using terrorism back then, primarily assassinating members of the Shah's government and Americans in Iran. Later on, they were part of the Iranian Revolution, but had a falling out with Khomeini. They wanted to execute the American hostages that eventually were released by the Khomeini government. They ended up siding with Saddam Hussein in the Iraq-Iran war and fought alongside Saddam against Iran, which caused them to be seen as traitors in the eyes of most Iranians. And then they ended up essentially becoming Saddam Hussein's private militia that he used to do ethnic cleansing against Shiites in the south and Kurds in the north of Iraq. They always had a rather well-funded machine in a Washington lobbying machine. And even while they were on the terrorist list, they were the only terrorist group that I can imagine that actually had offices downtown D.C., despite the fact that they were on the terrorist list. They managed to get out of the terrorist list after a massive lobbying campaign that arguably was illegal in 2012. And they have essentially zero support in Iran right now, and that raises the question, why have members of the Trump administration been so cozy with them? Are they not aware of the fact that this is a group that really has zero chance of taking over Iran? I think they actually do know these things, but there's something that MEK offers that no other opposition group offers. These members of the MEK, several thousand fighters that they have, are trained in both regular warfare as well as in guerrilla warfare. They have massive experience in terrorism, in assassinations, in sabotage, things that are not particularly helpful if your aim is to bring about democratic change in Iran, but actually could be very helpful if your aim is to engage in some form of a military confrontation with Iran or some form of effort to destabilize the country by starting a civil war. For those purposes, the MEK is the only Iranian opposition groups that actually can provide the type of qualities that are needed for this thing. And I suspect that that is part of the reason why they are being so cozy with the Trump administration right now, precisely for these purposes.
Shrita Parsi, we want to thank you for being with us, founder and president of the National Iranian American Council. We'll link to your pieces, your latest book, Losing an Enemy, Obama, Iran, and the Triumph of Diplomacy. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, the direct action against nuclear weapons in the United States. We'll talk about the Plowshares movement. Stay with us.
God of the poor man, this is how the day began. A co-defendant, I, Daniel Berrigan. Oh, and only a layman's batch of napalm. We pulled the draft files out, we burned them in the parking lot. Better the files than the bodies of children. They had no right before the love of you.
I Had No Right by Dar Williams. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman as we look at the resistance against nuclear weapons here in the United States. Last April 4th, the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination, 7 Catholic Plowshares activists secretly entered Naval Submarine Base Kings Bay in Georgia, one of the largest nuclear submarine bases in the world. Armed with just hammers, crime scene tape, baby bottles containing their own blood, and an indictment charging the U.S. government with crimes against peace. Their goal, to symbolically disarm the nuclear weapons at the base, which is home to at least 6 nuclear ballistic missile submarines. Each submarine carries 20 Trident thermonuclear weapons. The activists said they were following the prophet Isaiah's command to beat swords into plowshares. It was the latest of 100 similar anti-nuclear plowshares actions around the world, beginning in 1980 in King of Prussia, Pennsylvania. That first Plowshares Act was led by the late Daniel and Philip Berrigan. Phil's wife, Liz McAllister, was one of the 7 arrested at the April 4th action. Liz McAllister and 2 other activists, Jesuit priest Stephen Kelly and Mark Colville, remain locked up in pretrial confinement in Brunswick, Georgia. 4 others, Patrick O'Neill, Carmen Trotta, Martha Hennessy, and Claire Grady, are under house arrest. All 7 could face years in prison if convicted. Well, I recently spoke to Martha Hennessy and Carmen Trotta here in New York at Mary House, a Catholic worker home here in the city. Hennessy is the granddaughter of Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic worker movement. Carmen Trotta helps run the St. Joseph Catholic Worker House here in the city. I spoke to them shortly before Claire Grady was released and put under house arrest. I began by asking Martha Hennessy about what they did when they entered the nuclear subbase April 4th.
I was with my friends, 7 of us, and we spent nearly 2 years discerning and praying about what we could do. And we walked onto the base at Kings Bay. It's not a well-known site of the U.S. military. And we walked there on behalf of people who couldn't do such a thing or take such an action. And we walked there to expose the Trident nuclear arsenal, and we symbolically disarmed the nuclear weapons. We were not anywhere near nuclear weapons, but Carmen's group got a little bit closer to the bunkers. But essentially, we left Daniel Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine, there on site at the administrative building of the Strategic Weapons Facility of the Atlantic. We posted an indictment on the doors of the facility. We also had banners that read, "The ultimate logic of Trident is omnicide," and we put up crime tape.
And where did you go? Where did you?
I was at the administration building.
And why did you feel this was so important to do?
I believe that the United States nuclear arsenal is the linchpin of white imperialism being wrought upon the world. I think that we have used these nuclear weapons in ways since Hiroshima 73 years ago. We've used this threat against the world in many different ways throughout history. And I felt that for myself, I was able to take this kind of action, to do this kind of discernment, and offer up an effort to wake the world to the terrible dangers that we face. These weapons, as long as we have them, at some point they will be used. And I have had trips to Russia, Korea, South Korea, and Iran. And when I hear President Trump threatening these other countries, I can only take him seriously and take responsibility, personal responsibility myself, to try and raise a voice to make it obvious what is in the minds of these war planners.
And Carmen Trotta, you, together with Martha Hennessy and 5 others, went on this military base, the Kings Bay Naval Base. Describe what you did that day.
Took a very long walk inside the base. The small group that detached with myself wanted very much to get as close as we possibly could to the heart of evil, which is to say the weapon systems themselves. And therefore, we were disgruntled, really, initially, that there were no Trident submarines being worked on at the base at the time. If that were so, we would have tried to get to the Trident itself. The fact was that was not so at the time, and therefore we went to go to the bunkers where the nuclear weapons themselves are housed, and managed to cut a few fences, and were very perplexed by the complexity of the last fence, frightened by it, frightened by being in a lethal force zone. And as we were contemplating getting through that last fence, there was finally, after a couple of hours on the base, a response from the base itself. And then we held our banner, which said that nuclear weapons are illegal and immoral, and wanted to show to the military to something soothing to be able to say to them when they came. And so when they came, we told them immediately that we come in peace, that we were unarmed, that we were American citizens, that we meant them no harm.
And what did you have with you when you got to that area near the bunker?
We had hammers and blood and bolt cutters.
What do you mean blood?
There are vials of blood that were taken from people in the community, so it was our own blood. And the blood gets used as a symbol of life, particularly within the Catholic or Christian faith, that blood is the symbol of life. It is also, that level of red is also a constant danger warning. And as I think I've tried to say before, that Plowshare's actions are designed to sort of slap people awake and to the reality that is before them. It is more alarm than anger. We are more alarmed than we are angry. Although I don't want to put down the notion of being angry and the sort of persistent failure of what could and should be, one of the greatest nations in the world, and the ongoing, persistent failure, particularly after World War II.
Martha Hennessy, what happened when you went to the administrative building? How many people did you go with? What did you come with? And how did the military find you on the base?
Well, they ignored us for a while. They had their hands full with the people at the bunker. They were most concerned about the people at the bunker.
With your group?
Yes.
With Carmen
the three
and his
people.
Group.
And so I was with one other person, and the two of us brought little hammers and vials of blood and Dan Ellsberg's book, The Doomsday Machine. And we put up our posters, and we saw that there were people working in the building, and we did not go into the building. The door was unlocked, but it was very quiet, very eerie.
And what happened when the soldiers came?
Well, we were able to post our indictment and pour our blood and write, love one another and may love disarm us all. We wrote that on the sidewalks. And then we joined two other people who were at the display, the missile display, which welcomes visitors into the complex. And we joined them, and we probably were there for perhaps an hour in both settings before we saw the cars going towards the other site where our friends were, but they didn't bother to handle us until at least an hour later.
Who were you with?
I was with Claire Grady, Patrick O'Neill, and Mark Koval.
And they are?
They're all still, well, Patrick is out. 3 of us are released. We have family members to attend to, and the 4 are still in. Claire, Elizabeth McAllister, Stephen Kelly, and Mark Koval are all still at the Brunswick detention facility.
Can you talk about the people you were there with? Can you talk about Liz McAllister and the significance of her engaging in this Plowshares action? She is one of those who remains imprisoned, has now been imprisoned since April 4th. That's 3 months.
Right, you often hear of the Berrigans. Every time you hear of the Berrigans, you should think of Liz McAllister, because she is You could say she is certainly among the Berrigans. And I think, a very compelling force in drawing this community together was that at this kind of late stage in her life, she still had the heart and courage and soul to want to confront this enormous crime, war crime, ongoing, something that the family had engaged in for years. I mean, these are, the Berrigans, along with Liz, after the war in Vietnam, they having recognized the horror of Vietnam, having resisted it persistently for years, when the war finally ended, they said, okay, so this episode of American history has ended. The empire is still here, and the empire needs to be exposed by an informed citizenry if we are to continue to live in a democracy. And they've been fighting that battle until the present day. Indeed, our action was the latest version of it.
There have been scores of Plowshares actions ever since Liz McAllister's husband, Phil Berrigan, and her brother-in-law, Dan Berrigan, led that action on the King of Prussia GE plant in 1980, almost 40 years ago. Explain what the Plowshares movement is, why it's called Plowshares.
Well, comes out of the prophecy from Isaiah 2:4, that there would come a point in time where people of faith would beat swords into plowshares, spears into pruning hooks. We would no longer wage war upon, nations would no longer wage war upon other, nor would they study war anymore. To get better and better at it, to continue in that drive of violence, of competition.
This wasn't Liz McAllister's first Plowshares action?
No. She did one, I think it was in 1983.
1983, the Griffiths Air Force.
It was your first action.
Oh, yeah.
Carmen.
Yeah.
Martha, was this your first action?
Yes, my first Plowshares action.
What made you decide to engage in this?
Well, I had participated in a previous group, and the discussion around the fact that this kind of a process brings us to a place of self-disarmament really resonated with me. And I wanted to understand that at a deeper level. If we are trying to live lives, Christ-like lives of caring for those most needy and opposing war, I felt that I needed to really explore what this kind of an action would look like. It's a faith journey for me. It certainly has deepened my faith and understanding of what it means to be a follower of Christ in our own times. But it's that self-disarmament, and that also goes along with the work that we do with taking care of the homeless, where we must wear the rough edges off of ourselves to make ourselves holier and more available to this kind of work, that willingness to self-sacrifice.
So can you talk about the charges against you now and the years in prison that you face?
Yes, we were initially given state charges, which a month later were turned into federal charges, and the 4 charges are, and we consider having 4 charges to be very redundant, but they are conspiracy, trespass, depredation of government property, destruction of naval property, something like that. And I think for each count, the trespass is a misdemeanor facing 6 months, but the others are more serious, anywhere from 5 to 10 years. But they tend to threaten us with the worst because they do not want citizens going onto these military bases. And so, yes, we do face serious charges.
Now let's talk about the trial. Will you be able to bring up your reasons for doing what you did?
Highly unlikely. I mean, the federal courts have done an excellent job since 1980 of disallowing any kind of necessity defense. Of course, we want to talk about the Nuremberg principles. We want to talk about the Geneva Conventions. We want to talk about nuclear weapons, Trident submarine system. But typically what has occurred is prosecution demands a whole list of terms that cannot be presented. So the jury never hears who we are, what we did, why we did what we did.
So what do they think? You went onto the base and...
Everything gets reduced to destruction of property and trespass. So we end up focusing on cut fences rather than focusing on what's behind those fences.
Now, your lawyers have presented a motion to dismiss in court. And among those they cited were the declarations of Catholic Bishop Thomas Gumbleton, who declared that the actions of the Kings Bay plowshares are totally consistent with and supported by Catholic social teaching that any use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is totally immoral. Will the jurors be able to hear this?
It will be a miracle if any of those declarations, both from a religious perspective, from a physician's or social responsibility perspective, from a military perspective, and from a professor of the law perspective, it will be a miracle if any of those testimonies get into the court.
And so why do you do what you do?
We do what we do because that's what we're called to do. And it's not necessarily a question of success or failure. And who knows? The Holy Spirit works in strange ways. Perhaps there is some kind of window in this current climate where some of these discussions can happen. I mean, it's a dialogue that desperately needs to happen. And the world is waiting for the U.S. courts to do what's right.
How are you preparing for years in prison? Martha?
It's hard to say how one would prepare for something like that. It's a stripping down process. I mean, I spent 2 months recently in prison, and that gave me a taste of what life would be like. And
before you were released now with your ankle monitors.
And, you know, the works of mercy require us to attend to the imprisoned, and one very good way of doing that is living with them. And so I do my best to prepare emotionally and spiritually.
And Carmen, how are you preparing?
I'm not sure that there is a way to prepare. I will say that there came a point, I didn't mind. My initial fears of going to prison had to do with violence among the prisoners. And I saw almost none of that. In fact, I saw a lot of cohesion among the prisoners. There was the potential for violence from the guards. But it was after 2 months that for the first time I realized that the greatest fear about prison is depression, about having your life so neutralized, so stopped short, which is why I say, write cards to people, keep in touch with people, see how they're feeling in prison. Because there did come a time where I thought to myself, you know, brother, you are sleeping too much. Because there's nothing outside that cell door to go to, and you need to sort of change that and get out there. And I had a Guatemalan cellmate who was a joy to me. And so in many ways, he kept me sane.
Was he an immigrant prisoner?
Oh, yeah, there were 5 of them in our cell.
Immigrant detainees?
Yeah. There were 5 of them. They were all sort of heroic. They came here to labor and send money back to their families. And, and they were a remarkably good set of people. I wish I spoke Spanish and could have gotten more deeply involved with them. In fact, I forgot my roommate's name immediately upon hearing it. He forgot my name, or couldn't believe perhaps that my name was Carmen. And so I always called him compañero, and he always called me my friend, or sir, my friend.
So as we move into the 73rd anniversary of the dropping of the nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you move towards your trial, starting with President Obama, then on to President Trump, there is a multi-billion-dollar they call it updating of the nuclear arsenal, and that's moving forward. President Trump is castigating his NATO allies to spend more money on military. to engage in more military spending, demanding this of Germany and France and other NATO allies. Your final thoughts, Martha Hennessy.
Well, William Hartung has spoken to that with regards to the cost. I mean, it is a theft from the poor. It is bleeding our society. These billions of dollars are going directly into the pockets of a very few weapons manufacturer. There's no democratic aspect to this process whatsoever. A lot of the decision-making is very hidden, very secret. Donald Trump is taking care of his friends, and it's an absolute theft from the globe, and it's also an environmental catastrophe. So,
in what way?
Well, just there have already been probably 1 million casualties. What with the actual dropping of the 2 bombs on these open cities, but also in the production and the open-air testing, Rocky Flats, Hanford, Oak Ridge,
Marshall
Island peoples. All of these people have been affected over the decades, and there have been many, many, many casualties already.
And finally, Carmen Trotta.
It's the ongoing sort of promotion of competition as opposed to cooperation with the earth, with the planet, cooperation with other human communities. Your friend, very much admired here, Noam Chomsky, talks about the end of organized life, that what we are looking at in 2018, what the next generation is looking at, is the end of organized life. And the 2 things that he goes on in this speech about are global warming on the one hand and the nuclear arms race.
That was Carmen Trotta, who helps run the St. Joseph Catholic Worker House here in New York City, and Martha Hennessy, granddaughter of Dorothy Day, the founder of the Catholic Worker Movement. I spoke to them at Mary House, the other Catholic Worker House here in New York City, both wearing ankle monitors before trial so the government can track them. This is Democracy Now! When we come back, what's happening in Israel and Palestine? Stay with us.
في بينا أمل للتحرير نحلم فيه في بينا وعي لازم نحارب فيه في بينا قدس محتاجة فينا النور في بينا وطن أمل فينا بالتحرير.
We Have Hope by Revolution Makers here on Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We end today's show in Israel, where a fragile ceasefire remains in effect after 4 Palestinians and 1 Israeli soldier was killed during violence Friday along the border with Gaza. During the flare-up, Israel launched dozens of strikes it said were targeted at Hamas rockets and mortars. The death of the Israeli soldier was the first since Palestinians launched weekly nonviolent protests at the border in March. Israeli forces have shot and killed at least 140 Palestinians during those protests, while well over 12,000 have been injured. This comes as Israeli lawmakers drew condemnation Thursday for passing a law that defines Israel as the nation-state of the Jewish people and gives them the sole right to self-determination. The law declares Hebrew the country's only official language and encourages the building of Jewish-only settlements on occupied territory as a national value. This is Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu.
This is a defining moment in the annals of Zionism and the history of the State of Israel.
The controversial bill passed on a vote of 62 to 55 over the objection of Arab Israeli lawmakers who threw papers in the air in protest after its passage. For more, we're joined by Democracy Now! Video stream by Yusuf Munayer, the executive director of the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and joining us in studio, Rebecca Vilkomerson, executive director of Jewish Voice for Peace, co-authored a new op-ed in The Independent headlined, "As Jews, we reject the myth that it's anti-Semitic to call Israel racist." We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Yusuf, let's begin with you. If you can talk about what's happened in Gaza right now, the death toll up to 140, and then move on to the law that was just passed on Thursday.
Sure. Well, the most recent events that we've seen in the Gaza Strip are sort of a escalation that happens from time to time and forces, many in the media and us here in the United States and the outside world to tune back in to Gaza based on the fear that it is on the brink of yet another major Israeli bombardment. But the reality is that in those moments when we are not tuned in, the constant and structural violence that Palestinians in Gaza face because of the occupation, because of the policies of Israeli siege, and because of the violent methods of enforcement that the Israeli military uses to support those policies, continues all the time. And this is altogether part of a broader agenda by the State of Israel to quell any sort of resistance to what it seeks to do throughout the entirety of the territory, which is to impose its will on the native population of Palestinians, both in the West Bank and Gaza and occupied territories, but also on Palestinian citizens of Israel, under the premise that it is the Jewish population that is in control, that deserves to be in control, and that any rights at all that may be afforded to non-Jews are really done as a favor and not something that the Jewish state has to do because of principles of equality or tolerance or democracy or anything like that. And the most recent step that the Israeli Knesset has taken through the passage of this law, I think, is the best proof of that, showing very clearly that the Israelis no longer care about, even pretending to balance this notion of being a Jewish state and a democracy. No, I think that was never the case. Now it's clear that they're not even interested in pretending anymore. And in fact, the initiator and sponsor of this legislation said after its passage, we are passing this bill to make sure that no one has any doubt or even any thoughts about Israel being a state of all its citizens. So it's very clearly aimed at enshrining inequality, enshrining apartheid in a constitutional way within Israeli law.
Rebecca Vilkomerson, if you can respond to this, what's being called the nation-state law that's been passed.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Yusuf said is exactly right. I think I found it shocking but not surprising, because I think any time you have a set of, again, foundational law, this is a basic law, so it's sort of the equivalent of a constitutional bill that will then have an impact on any future laws. And it basically obligates the state to treat its non-Jewish citizens unequally. And that's 20% of the overall Israeli population. So by Israel enshrining racism and discrimination and apartheid into its basic law, that's pretty shocking. At the same time, not that surprising because of the ongoing policies that Israel has been pursuing for so many decades.
And the response of the Jewish community?
Well, here in the United States, I think it's been interesting because there's much more unanimity than there usually is against this bill. Everyone from J Street to the American Jewish Committee to the reform and conservative movements, which together represent half of American Jewry. Even some right-wing organizations like the ADL have had some limited concerns about the bill. And I think it's a reflection of, Peter Beinart sort of had this seminal essay that he wrote in 2010, which talked about the ways that the Jewish Israeli population was moving to the right and the American Jewish population is staying sort of liberal and progressive, and there's a split that's happening, and I think we're seeing the fruition of that, and people are just horrified by this sort of extreme right-wing agenda that I think the Netanyahu government is feeling empowered by the Trump administration to enact fully.
You wrote a piece in the Independent signed by, about how 40 Jewish groups from 15 different countries have signed this joint statement condemning attempts to stifle criticism with false accusations, you say, of anti-Semitism.
Right. This was a pretty historic moment. We had 40 organizations from around the world, Jewish and Israeli organizations. And we felt like it was very important because there's so many efforts right now worldwide, lots of different specific strategies and tactics, but worldwide trying to legislate definitions of anti-Semitism that sometimes include chilling language at the very minimum and sometimes actually legislate that forms of anti-Zionism or certain critiques of Israel would be defined as anti-Semitic. And this has resulted in bank accounts being shut down in Germany and in the UK, people being prosecuted in France. Here in the United States, there's something called the Anti-Semitism Awareness Act, which would make it potentially, extremely difficult for people to speak out politically against Israeli human rights violations. So we felt it was very important to lend a Jewish voice against that and to say that BDS is a legitimate tactic to be using in this particular moment. That's
You're talking about the boycott,
divestment, and sanctions, yes.
Sanctions movement. Yusuf Monier, what happens from here after this law is passed and also in Gaza?
Well, I think there's great concern for what may happen in Gaza in the coming months. Of course, as we know, in the major Israeli bombardments of Gaza in 2008, 2009, and in the fall of 2012, in the summer of 2014, all of them preceded Israeli elections by a matter of months. And we are, expecting Israeli elections in 2019. And given the recent behavior of the ruling coalition, with the passage of all kinds of right-wing legislation aimed at rallying the support of its base, I would not be surprised if they were to attempt another sort of massive operation against the Palestinian population in Gaza ahead of elections once again. So that's something that I would definitely keep my eye on.
Yusuf Moner, we have to leave it there for now. U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, and Rebecca Vilkomerson, Jewish Voice for Peace. That does it for our show. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.